In late summer, somewhere between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic coast, you could once walk into a field where the corn rose higher than your head. Maize stalks thick as your wrist, beans climbing them in green spirals, squash sprawling at your feet, its broad leaves shading the earth so completely that if you pushed your hand under them, the soil was still cool and damp. No synthetic fertilizer, no steel plows, no motorized irrigation. And yet systems like this fed entire nations, from the St. Lawrence River down through the Ohio Valley and across the eastern woodlands for centuries. The question is not just how did they grow corn here, it is what did they understand about this land that we have forgotten. If you could cut this agriculture open like a cross-section, you'd see 3 layers. At the surface lies the physical system, small mounds of earth, each one a tiny engineered habitat. In each mound, a ring of maize seeds. When the young plants reached a hand's length, beans went in at their base. Around the outside, squash and pumpkin. No endless straight rows, a patterned mosaic of 3 sisters polycultures. Between these mounds, footpaths linked household gardens to larger communal fields, to storage pits dug into sandy rises and lined with bark or woven mats to keep grain dry through winter. In some river valleys, low ridges and shallow ditches guided rainwater gently across the fields instead of letting it tear the soil away. Around this sat the social system. In Haudenosaunee towns, in Wabanaki and Powhatan villages, in Mississippian communities farther south, maize farming was coordinated. Women's councils decided when to begin planting and when to open the stored harvest. Kin groups worked specific plots together. Children learned to count by placing 4 kernels of corn and 3 beans into each mound. Threaded through both was the knowledge system. Planting followed not a fixed calendar date, but a web of signs. The thawing of the soil, the leafing of certain trees, the rising of particular stars before dawn. Stories personified corn, beans, and squash as sisters who had agreed to live together and help each other grow. Ceremonies marked the first sprouting, the green corn, the final harvest. This was not primitive gardening. It was a designed system linking soil, water, plants, people, and time. To build and sustain it took careful, cumulative science. There was soil knowledge, where the spring floods dropped new silt, where the ground held moisture longest, where it baked hard in drought. Farmers learned to enrich mounds with fallen leaves, fish remains along coasts and rivers, and ash from controlled burns. They saw that bare soil crusted and cracked, while soil covered by squash stayed dark and alive. There was ecological knowledge. Beans, as legumes, quietly fixed nitrogen into the soil that the maize drew up. Squash leaves shaded out many weeds and reduced evaporation. Tall corn sheltered beans from wind. Grown together, these crops often produced more per area than when planted alone, while protecting each other. There was also hydrology and climate sense. Fields were placed not in the absolute lowest land, where late frosts and floods could kill seedlings, but on slightly raised terraces where moisture could move in and out. In years when rains failed, attention shifted to fields nearer streams and seeps. Knowledge of when to risk a second planting and when to conserve seed was honed over generations. None of this was recorded in textbooks. It was recorded in outcomes, in which fields held yield through a dry year, which mounding patterns resisted erosion, which seed lines kept producing under new conditions. The experiments ran for centuries. To see how this lived, follow one person for a day. Imagine a woman in a Haudenosaunee town near what is now central New York, 500 years ago. At first light, she steps out of her longhouse and walks to the edge of the fields. She looks and she listens. The river is lower than it was yesterday. The night's rain was light. She presses a foot against a mound. It holds shape. The squash vines have shed the water. The corn leaves are still deep green, the beans just beginning to flower. She does not call this data, but she is reading it. Later, with her sister, she moves between the mounds, pulling the few weeds that have made it through the squash canopy, checking for insect damage on the lower leaves. At a mound where the beans have overwhelmed the young corn, she gently unwinds them and adds a wooden stake. At another, where the corn failed to sprout, she judges whether the neighboring mounds and spare extra ears come harvest. At midday, she joins other women at the central fire. They speak of how the lower fields are ahead of the upper ones this year, and whether the green corn ceremony should be nudged so all parts of the community can participate. No one calls this a planning meeting. It is understood as part of the rhythm of the year. In the evening, after corn soup thick with beans and squash, she tells her children the story of the three sisters: why corn stands tall, why beans climb, why squash spreads low to shade their shared feet. The children hear a story. They are also, without realizing it, inheriting a manual. This system was not fragile. In years of drought, families leaned on fields nearer streams and on stored grain. Communities that had spread their fields across different soils and elevations, bottomlands, terraces, uplands, rarely lost everything at once. In wet years, when floods took the lowest plantings, higher plots and mounds built to shed water buffered the loss. As populations shifted, through migration, through war, fields could be expanded or rested. Some plots were allowed to return temporarily to forest or grass, letting roots and leaf litter rebuild the soil, then were brought back into cultivation later. Diversity of crops, of varieties, of locations was itself a form of resilience. What finally struck hardest were not only weather and conflict, but colonial systems that attacked the three layers at once. Physically, European livestock turned loose in indigenous landscapes, trampled and compacted fields. Forest clearing, mill dams, and drainage reshaped watercourses that fields had been tuned to for generations. Displacement onto smaller, less fertile parcels cut communities off from many of the soils and microclimates that made their agriculture robust. Socially, epidemics tore through villages, killing both those who did the work and those who carried the memory of how, when, and where it should be done. Missionaries and officials tried to undermine the authority of women in agricultural decision-making, insisting on European property norms and gender roles. At the level of knowledge, boarding schools and religious campaigns targeted the very stories and ceremonies through which planting wisdom was transmitted. Children were punished for speaking the languages that held the names of soils, stars, and seeds. Rituals around green corn and harvest were forbidden. The mounds could be flattened in a season. The relationships and understandings that had shaped them were harder to erase, but pressure was constant. And yet, the system never vanished completely. Archaeologists walking plowed fields noticed rings of slightly raised soil where mounds had been. In cross-sections, they found dark, carbon-rich layers indicating long-term soil building. In storage pits, charred remains of maize, beans, and squash appeared together. Pollen drilled from lake sediments showed centuries of maize cultivation across broad regions with abrupt declines after contact, echoing native oral histories of loss and removal. For a long time, this evidence was filtered through an assumption that indigenous farmers were on their way towards European-style agriculture. The Three Sisters story was filed under myth, charming but not serious. Today, indigenous agronomists, farmers, and knowledge keepers are working with soil scientists and ecologists to re-examine that assumption. Lot trials with traditional polycultures and heirloom varieties show higher combined yields and better soil cover than monocrops. Measurements of water infiltration and evaporation across mounded fields confirm what farmers already knew. This design helps manage both drought and downpours. Oral histories, when listened to on their own terms, are being recognized as repositories of long-term environmental observation, not just folklore. What can we learn from this without pretending that we can or should simply go back? We are living in a time of exhausted soils, deepening droughts in some places, flooding in others. Much of our agriculture leans on mined nutrients and fossil fuels. The indigenous systems built around maize and the Three Sisters will not solve these problems by themselves, but they do offer tested principles. They show how diversity in fields can be a strength, how covering soil can protect it, how reading the landscape can replace some dependence on external inputs. They show that agronomy can be as much about relationships between species, between people and place, between generations, as about products. Most of all, they remind us that science doesn't only live in laboratories and journals. It also lives in cornfields, in stories, in hands that have learned the feel of good soil and the sound of a healthy river. Return for a moment to that late summer field. You stand between tall corn, beans winding upward, squash leaves cool against your ankles. Now you can see the system beneath the surface, the roots holding the ground, the shade protecting the microbes, the choices made centuries ago about where to plant, what to plant, and how to tell that story so it would be remembered. We often call this pre-colonial history, as though it were a closed chapter, but it might be more honest to call it something else, a long, detailed set of experiments in how to live in one place without burning it out. This is before America. If you want to keep learning from the systems that were already old when the first Europeans appeared on the horizon, stay with us. The science in the cornfield is not finished speaking.